Welcome to the Little Sparks Podcast, your home for all things faith and music. I'm Cecilia.
And I'm Tara.
And we're former college roommates, professional musicians, and co-founders of the Hildegard Collective, a space for Catholic musicians to connect with one another and grow in their faith and profession. This podcast is an outreach of the collective, so if you're interested at all in Catholicism, music, or both, this is the podcast for you. Join us each week as we get real, share stories, and learn from other awesome Catholic musicians. We're all little sparks of God's divine creation, so together, let's ignite the world for Christ. Welcome back to the Little Sparks Podcast. We are now officially over halfway through the season, which is absolutely wild to think about. And this episode marks a little bit of a turn from our previous episodes. Okay, so we're on season 5. And we are going to be talking about some weightier topics, as the season goes on. And today is the very first one of those. So, Tara, do you want to introduce what we're going to be chatting about today?
Yes.
And all that good stuff.
We today are going to be talking about what to do if you've been sinned against, and that whole experience actually of being sinned against, because unfortunately it is far too common in the music industry. And it's something that I myself have experienced. And I felt kind of firsthand how isolating and horrible the experience is. And so we kind of thought this would be a good opportunity to, bring all of that really solidly into the light and to address this very important topic with our audience, partially for educational reasons, of course, but also so that anybody else who has or will experience something like this professionally knows that they're not alone. That's very important to both of us. And so just, I guess, before we get into the real meat of this episode, just if you listening to or watching this are very sensitive to discussions around sexual harassment and other such inappropriate behaviors, maybe give this episode a pass and we'll see you next week. or just proceed with caution, because we don't want this to be too upsetting for anybody to listen to.
Yes, absolutely. So with that being said, Tara, do you want to share a bit of your own story to start this episode off?
Yeah, I will. It's strange. Like, this is the first time I've talked in a very public way about this story, and it feels really weird. I was 18 when this actually started. It was my freshman year of college, and I was working some jobs with a particular company, and there was somebody else who was working for that company irregularly. He was sort of being brought in to certain specific performances where they needed somebody of his voice type to sing like a principal role in the performances that they were doing. Whereas I was local to the area and I was just in their regular chorus. So I was there for every performance that they did at the time. And when we first worked together, I was 18. I would say he was in his mid to late 30s at this time. We met at the dress rehearsal for a performance that we were doing together. And right away, being like in my first semester of music school, myself and my peers who were also in the chorus were like enamored by his talent. He was really, really, really good. And he made very difficult songs, very difficult passages look really easy. And so, knowing that we would be working with him again in the future, we went and introduced ourselves and didn't really think much of it. And in that particular show, that was the end of it. Nothing more happened. There was no further connection, no further contact on the back of that. About 6, maybe 7 months later, we were working together again. in another show with the same company. And this time he knew who we were. We knew who he was. So we started treating each other more as like colleagues, and we would converse during rehearsals and like in between performances and stuff like that. And it actually, to me, seemed pretty normal. Like there was nothing that weird about it. It was just pretty basic politeness. It was almost summer at this point, and we just talked about like summer plans. And I mentioned how that particular summer I was going to be having surgery. And I had 2 surgeries scheduled, and each operation had like a 6 to 8 week recovery time. So there was pretty much my whole summer was going to be getting surgery and then recovering from it, and then getting surgery again and then recovering from that. And that becomes important later in the story. And as college women are apt to do, we spent the day of the performance basically running around and taking pictures with each other when we weren't on stage. We were taking pictures with the other chorus members. We were taking pictures with the conductor and some of the instrumentalists and some of the principal singers. And we had like little costume pieces that we were posing in, and we were just having a good time taking pictures in the backstage area. And I remember myself and my friend asked this person for a picture, and he said yes. And then he had to go on stage, or we had to go on stage, and we were like, oh, we'll do it later. And we ran away. And we never ended up getting a picture that night, which was like not really that big of a deal. It was kind of whatever. It just didn't happen. It was fine. But the next day, when we were kind of leaving town after this performance was over, he sent me a text and was like, oh, we never got that picture together. Dang, like, I guess we'll have to do that next time. And it struck me as a little bit odd. It just seemed like an unusual thing to text someone, because it wasn't a big deal at all. So I just said, okay, yeah, cool. Well, nice to work with you again anyway, and like have a good summer or something. And then I went on my way and he went on his way. And then that began the summer, and it was probably a good 6 months of always late night weird messages that he would send me. And to me, it seemed, personally, he definitely seemed like he was drunk whenever he would send these messages. Sometimes they didn't make a lot of sense, or sometimes they would be saying just out of pocket weird things, usually about our colleagues in this company. And I really tried like not to engage. And definitely at the time, I was a pushover, massively so, way more than I am today. And I had such a fear of being perceived as rude, and I just wanted so badly to be a people pleaser. And I was never going to engage in any sort of negative talk about anybody else, or never engage in anything that was like inappropriate. Mm-hmm. But I felt a pressure to respond out of politeness. And I regret doing that. And so I kind of like politely entertained some of these messages. And some of them I definitely tried to put a stop to. Like, I remember there was at least one occasion that summer where he had asked for my address so that he could come visit me in my convalescence, I think was how it was phrased. And like that particular text, I remember, like, sent chills down my spine, because I was literally in bed, like incapacitated from the surgery. And it was so inappropriate to be asking me for my address so that he could come visit me in my bedridden state. It was just so inappropriate and so out of pocket. And I think that one, I just completely ignored, and he made some remark about how I never gave him my address, so he had to just bypass my house. He was going to visit one of his family members in another state, and he was like passing by or passing through the state that he knew I was from. And so he made some remark about how like it was a shame that he couldn't like stop and say hi or something weird. So that one was like, just let that one go. And going back then to my next semester of college, after the summer, there were red flags up all over my mind. I was like, something is wrong here. This is not an okay situation. And so I very carefully kind of screened the roster for the next performance and made sure he was not going to be performing with the company. And he wasn't, which is great. So I kind of told the company, I will do this one last performance and then I'm not going to do any more. And like nobody really questioned it. Nobody really pushed me as to why I was making that decision. And I didn't really share it with them. Without getting into too much detail, there was some reportedly similar behaviors going on with other people who were kind of higher up in this company, and definitely did not feel like it was the place to bring such a complaint of my own. Did not feel like it would be well received. So I just didn't say anything to the company. And I did that last performance. Even into that semester, actually, I continued receiving late night messages from this man. And then around the time of Christmas break, I had gotten tickets for myself and a friend to go see an opera together in New York. And it was going to be our first time going to the Met, and it was going to be to see my favorite opera of all time. And I was beside myself with excitement for this experience. Like, as you might imagine, I was like not sleeping, not eating, just like it was all I could talk about. It was all I could think about. I was so excited for this experience. The only caveat was that she was still working for this company, and she had a performance, I think the night before we were going to New York or something like that. And so she said, you can stay with me, because we all had to be out of our dorm rooms because, you know, of the university's rules. So she said, you can stay with me for that one extra night before we go to New York. You just like, I just have this performance, so you'll have to like tag along to this. And then we'll leave straight away afterwards, and we'll go home, and we'll go to New York, and we'll have a great time. And that sounded fair enough to me. I had kind of told her a little bit about some of the weird behavior from this guy, and she knew that I wasn't working for the company anymore. She knew that was the reason. And so she was like, I'll stick by you at this performance, and like, it'll be okay. Don't worry about it. And again, like, I wasn't performing with the company anymore. So I didn't have to be around this guy nearly as much as I would have like if I were singing.
Right.
But this night was where things got really weird and bad pretty quickly. So we arrived at the venue for the performance, and I was in a little bit of a weird position because this was like a ticketed event. And most of the people, not everybody, but most of the people who bought tickets were like dignitaries and diplomats and stuff like that. Like a lot of foreign diplomats would come to these events. And so it would look quite bad for the company if it looked like people were sneaking in without paying for tickets or something of the sort.
Yeah, right.
So I think understandably enough, they were like, we know who you are. of course you can be here and you can hang out, but because you're not singing and you don't have a ticket, just like hang out in the green room. And I was fine with that. They were giving me free food anyway, so couldn't complain too much. So we arrived at this venue. We were some of the first people there, and I just kind of plopped myself in a corner and I surrounded myself with other people's bags and other people's stuff. So there was like a little bit of a barrier there. And then probably 30 minutes later, this guy like arrived for the evening, and it was like a big hullabaloo, and he was saying hi to everybody, and he came over, he said hi to me, and I refused to get up. I just sat there surrounded by all those bags. And I think he like, it was cordial enough at the beginning. I think he was just like, oh, hey, good to see you again. I wasn't expecting to see you or something. Hope you're doing well. And I was like, okay, so far so good. Off to an okay start. And then I had every intention and desire of keeping this man at arm's length for the entire night. So it was when the cast kind of got in their lineup to go on and like walk on stage that I was like, okay, I'm probably safe to start moving around. And like, mind you, I was friends with like pretty much everybody who was involved in this performance. So I was excited to like watch from the door and like see everything that was happening on the stage and listen to their singing. So when they were lined up, I kind of went out to the area and like gave them all hugs and wished them all well. And then kind of placed myself off to the side of their lines where they were lined up. Mm-hmm. And I was watching, there was someone like, I think it was maybe the president of the company or something, was giving some sort of talk on the stage that I was standing and I was watching. And all of a sudden I felt these just big hands around my waist, just like holding me really tightly. And yeah, it's really uncomfortable even to talk about. And I felt this guy come and kind of press his nose up to my ear. And he said something to me. I think it was something along the lines of like, aren't you disappointed you're not singing in the show today? Or something like that. And I remember literally prying his fingers like off of my waist and saying, no, I'm not upset about it. Go stand in line. And he tried to kind of weasel his way back around me again. And I was like, no, you go stand in line. That is where you're supposed to be right now. And like, don't talk to me, basically. And he was kind of acting like all hurt that I had pushed him away. It was really weird. And so then they went on and they sang, and it was all well and good and everything was fine. And then when it was time for intermission, I sprinted back to the room, and I grabbed a seat. There was like a big round table in the middle of the room with a bunch of seats around it. And I grabbed a seat at this table, and I think I put bags or like somehow blocked the seats on either side of me so that when my friends came back, I had my friends sit on either side of me. And there was something happened around intermission where I had to go to the bathroom, but the bathroom at this particular venue was weirdly laid out in that in the like backstage green room area where we were, there was one singular bathroom, and it was like so it was in this hallway, and the door into the bathroom was just like a swing door. It didn't lock or anything. And you would walk in that door, and right in front of you was like a sink, like a little vanity with a sink and a mirror. And then to the left, there was like an individual toilet stall, and the door to that locked.
Okay.
But it was
Yeah.
Yeah, but so it was kind of like what you would expect of a public bathroom if there was like a men's and a women's bathroom, except it was single use. There was only one
Yeah.
toilet in there. Um, and I knew that the door to the hallway didn't lock, and so I asked my friend to come with me and basically stand guard outside the door because I was like, I'm not taking any chances. And so I went to the bathroom, and while I was in the bathroom, sure enough, this guy came and tried to follow me into the bathroom. And my
Oh my
friend,
God.
thankfully, thank God, like stopped him and was like, no, no, like turn around. And he was trying to put up this whole argument and probably make some like dumb excuses. And I was like terrified in the bathroom. And I was just basically trying to get out as fast as possible, just like
Yeah.
because honestly, who knows what would have happened if my friend hadn't been there or if he had somehow like forced his way in. I can only imagine. But it was a really terrifying experience, even knowing that he went to follow me to the bathroom is just really gross and horrible to think about.
Yeah.
So then, thankfully, that was kind of the only thing that happened at intermission. And then the second half of the show went by, and then all of a sudden the show was over, and they were having like a buffet dinner reception at the end of the show for the
Mm-hmm.
audience and also the cast, and we got to eat for free. And so everybody was going and getting food, and this was like my dinner for the day. Like my friend, we were going to be getting back to our house so late that it wouldn't have been feasible for us to make food at the time we would have gotten back to our house. And
Right.
so this was my dinner. But I also, bearing in mind that the president of the company had allowed me to stay on the conditions that I kind of stay away from the public because I don't have a ticket and I'm technically not supposed to be there. I couldn't go get myself food in the buffet.
Yeah.
So similar to the intermission, we were sat at the big round table in the middle of the room, and I had two friends on either side of me. And one of my friends was getting up to go get food. And I was so uncomfortable with this. I knew that it needed to happen because we needed to eat, but it was also leaving one of the chairs, it was the chair to the right of me, was going to be left vacant. And I basically said, okay, you can go get food, but please bring me back a plate and like literally go as fast as humanly possible, please. And she was like, I
Yeah.
will. And so she got up to leave the table, and literally as soon she was not even out the door, and this guy called across the room to her because he didn't have a chair. He was standing because there weren't enough chairs for everybody who was in the cast. And he called to her from across the room and said, can I take your chair? And she said, no, you may not. I'm going to be back in 2 minutes. And I like expect that chair to be free, basically. And then she went to go get her food. And of course, he did not listen.
Oh my
So
gosh.
he took the seat, sat down in the seat that was immediately right to my right. And he did not miss a beat. And he grabbed my leg like pretty far up my thigh, and he squeezed it really tight. And as he was doing this, he looked at one of the other singers, and he said, don't these kids know that we can destroy their careers before they even start if they don't give us what we want? And I have those words like seared into my brain because I don't think I've ever been so terrified in my life. Um,
Yeah.
it was a really, really horrible experience. And especially for me, like anybody who knew me in college, opera was like my first love. It was
Yeah.
everything to me in college, and I was putting in the work, like literally blood, sweat, and tears to um, to really kind of curate my voice and get myself to a point where I could have a viable career in this field that I like loved so much. And for this man who, I will say, in his own right was fairly successful, like he was pretty well known, like at least in that region. And he was making his career singing full time. And for him to threaten me in that way, like we'll call a spade, like that was a threat.
Oh yeah, 100%.
And for him to threaten me that way, as like having just finished, my first year of college, I'm not even halfway through yet. And for him to posture himself as somebody who could destroy my career if I didn't succumb to his every will was so scary and terrifying. And so him and this singer who he'd made this comment to kind of laughed for a minute about like, yeah, these like silly little like students or whatever. Now this other singer, I don't think she had any idea what was going on. Like, I think she thought that he was just like making a lighthearted joke about my fellow young people in the chorus. Ha ha ha.
Yeah.
So I don't like blame her for kind of laughing along with it, because I truly don't think she understood what was happening in that moment.
Right.
So eventually my friend came back with food and we ate, and when she came back, she kicked him out of her chair, sat back down. And then I think literally as soon as I was done eating, I retreated back to that corner with like all the bags surrounding me. And I just like sat there, crisscross applesauce, not moving for the rest of the night. And then when he was getting up to leave and go home, he was going around saying goodbye to everybody. And he came up and he stood in front of me and he said, "What, do I not get a goodbye hug?" And I, for once, actually stopped this man and I looked at him and I said, no, you do not. You can leave now. And so he left, and I don't think I ever heard from him again. I don't think. We never worked together. He eventually ended up moving somewhere very far away. And he got quite a lucrative contract, like full-time contract somewhere else. So he left. I never went back to that company. And actually, I remember the following semester of college, we had a class. It was like a school-wide lecture, basically. And we had one of these lectures on basically what to do in a situation where like somebody is holding their power over you in this industry, and like how to go about reporting and stuff like that. And it was really interesting, actually. And certainly, it captured my attention. And I remember afterwards, actually, I talked to two different college professors individually. And I just gave them a super, super vague idea of what had happened to me. And I just said somebody had been behaving quite inappropriately with me, both in speech and in action. And I wanted to go about reporting them, but I didn't know how to do it because the particular company where these incidents happened, there was no HR. It was very small. There was no real structure of management. And as I said before, the only people who I could have even conceived of reporting this situation to within the company had kind of similar allegations floating around and like rumors out there. None of that involved me, so I cannot confirm or deny whether any of that was true. But probably not the best people to bring this to.
Right.
And then the only other thing I could think of doing was going to the union, because I knew that this man was a paying member of AGMA, and that in theory, the union could reprimand him. The only problem was I was really discouraged from doing that by these two professors. And I think it was probably the right decision, because they said, unfortunately, at the end of the day, the way the union works, like, he was a paying member. He was paying his annual union dues. I was not. I was a student. They did not know who I was. I had no prior connection to the union whatsoever. And at the end of the day, it likely, like, barring the messages that I have from this person, it likely would have come down to my word against his word. And their loyalty, I suppose, most likely and unfortunately would probably lie with the person who's a paying member of their union.
Yeah.
So I actually didn't end up reporting it anywhere. And that's something that I've thought about a lot in the years since this happened. Because not only, in my lack of reporting, not only did I let this man go work for other companies with a squeaky clean record, he's also married and was married at the time.
Oh my gosh.
It was, yeah, it's just something that, like, I can't go back and change it, but I question very often whether I made the right decision in that situation. There were other factors at play. Like, at the time, he literally knew where I lived. And that was something that was very scary to me. I wanted to protect myself.
Understandably so.
Yeah, I wanted to protect myself, and I wanted to protect my safety. I also think often I was so preoccupied with trying to find some sort of, like, professional repercussion and punishment for this man that, quite literally, the thought did not even once even cross my mind that this is also just civilly illegal and, like, a breach of law. And I could have reported this as harassment to the police, and it could have been filed and dealt with that way. It truly did not even occur to me to do that until many years later, when one of my good friends, who's not in the music world at all, asked me why I didn't do that. And it was the first time I had even thought about that. I feel like so often in these situations, we think so much about professional repercussions, trying to, make sure that these people, face justice in a professional way, since it is a professional abuse of power. Right. But, like, we completely overlook the fact that, like, it's illegal. You can just report this to, like, the civic authorities, and they are obliged to do something about it. So that's,
what's crazy is, like, you say that, and that's the first time it had occurred to me that you could have done that. Like, that's just crazy. You know?
No, it is crazy. And shortly after this, maybe like about 2 years later, was when the kind of the Me Too movement really kind of took a hold of the music world, and we started seeing even some longtime figures getting rightfully taken down because of their atrocious behavior towards their subordinates. There was a series that existed at that time, and for the life of me, I think it's been scrubbed from the internet, because I did try to go back and find it, and I couldn't find any record of it. But it was for an opera publication, and it was, like, basically an anonymous column that people would write in their stories of being harassed or assaulted in the opera industry. Most of the time they didn't name anybody, like, all the names would be changed in the story.
Yeah.
But it was supposed to sort of expose this enormous problem in the industry and bring some light to these stories that may have otherwise been hidden away, some for many decades and some that were quite fresh and new. And I actually wrote in to the editor and I wrote out this whole story. And she wrote back to me saying that she wanted to publish it as part of the series. But then, like, very shortly afterwards, maybe like a week later, she actually announced that she was going to be stopping the series and discontinuing it because it was too heavy, like for her to be going into work and spending literally all day
Mm,
reading stories of people being like harassed and assaulted, sometimes very, very brutally. It was too much for her to do that day in and day out, which is so
yeah.
fair and so understandable. So my
Yeah.
story actually never got published, which is okay. Um, but it certainly was one of probably a few moments in the years since this has happened that I have been able to really stop and step back from the situation and just like reflect on everything that led up to that situation and everything that happened afterwards and
Hmm.
think about, my response to everything, how it affected my perception of my career and myself, even as an artist.
Yeah.
And it just kind of start to break all those things down and heal from those things. So like, even though this is the first time I'm sort of articulating this story in any sort of public forum, um, I'm very grateful for all of those small opportunities to take a step back and take a little piece of myself back from this man and from the situation and like
Yeah, absolutely.
heal even a little bit from that like kind of crazy situation. So
Yeah, it's absolutely atrocious, what happened to you. And I'm just like I'm thinking now about because I didn't know you like submitted your story to, that publication. And that just really just is so heartbreaking that she was getting that many entries
mhm.
from people with these stories that were just so heavy that she had to stop it because it wasn't good for her to be going through so like that volume of stories.
Yeah,
um it's really I mean, it's a tragedy that it happens at all in this world, and it's a tragedy that it happens so frequently in the music world. I feel very blessed that I've never experienced something like this, but between especially during school, I feel, but even back in high school, I remember, knowing someone who was experiencing a harassment situation from someone much older, much, higher, like, in terms of like power and authority, um, that she knew through, I think it was like, a summer intensive, or something like that.
mhm.
um just so many different people and their stories of things like this happening, even if it isn't full on assault or abuse. It's the harassment, even just that is not, it's just so heartbreaking,
Yeah,
that in an industry where our job is to create beauty and bring beautiful music to people, that there's so much ugliness behind the scenes.
yeah. Something actually that we kind of talked about on our platform, actually, in one of our recent webinars with our guest, Tony Manfredonia, was we talked about how important vulnerability is to the creation of good art. And
Mm,
I still very much maintain that stands, that vulnerability to a greater or lesser degree is so crucial and important in the step between being a good artist and being a great artist. But it also leaves us all the more open to being wounded, which is actually what the word vulnerable means. It means like,
I had no idea.
yeah, Father Gregory Pine actually taught me that at a lecture of his that I went to. But
That's really cool.
the word vulnerability actually means like to be open to woundedness. And
Wow.
yeah, so like chew on that one for a while. That's pretty deep.
Yeah.
But it is difficult and challenging because as you said, Cecilia, like these situations should never occur in our world at all. And they should never occur in this industry where we are all called to be vulnerable and to have an openness to being wounded. That's something that we should seek to protect in each other and look out for each other.
Oh my gosh.
Not
Yeah.
at all, take advantage of. And the threats and the harassment and the intimidation and, the assault that is so prevalent in this industry has to stop. Like back when I submitted my story for publication, I was religiously reading every story that came through that platform, because in a certain sense, I wanted to be equipped to protect myself in case I ever found myself in a situation like that again, or even worse, God forbid. But also I felt I had a certain duty of care to my fellow man and my fellow, opera singer. At the time I was in like mentally and emotionally in like a pretty good place with everything. And I felt like I had the space within myself to take on some of those stories that I was reading. But wow, like some of them are really, really heavy and hard to read. And there was, like abuse of substances involved, and stories that were much more graphic and horrific and like traumatizing than even what I had experienced. And I think like I pray that nobody listening to this podcast episode has ever experienced something like this, because it's horrible. Like it's a really horrific experience. But it's also something that I think we need to be talking about, because it's something that happens, unfortunately, like not infrequently in our career.
Mm-hmm.
And, like Jesus talks about in the Bible, how everything that's done in darkness is going to be brought to light. And I have found in myself that it was really only when I began opening up about this experience to some of my friends, particularly other musicians, like Catholic music friends who understand the circumstances and understand the career and the environment in which this was allowed to happen. It was really when I started bringing those things into the light, kind of slowly but surely, that I began to really heal in myself from that experience.
Yeah.
So, like, if you are somebody who's experienced any type of intimidation or harassment or assault or anything, whether it is from within the music industry or from without, if it's, it could be someone in school or someone in your family, like, please, please, please find someone that you trust, whether that is a friend or a family member or, your parish priest, and begin to bring those things to light when and how you feel safe doing so. Because when I was kind of allowing this situation to fester in my own heart, and I was just sitting with it, like at the time, the year that this happened to me, I was living alone, which probably didn't help. And when I would sit by myself, at the end of the day in my room and just be thinking about all these things and having these situations playing over and over and over again in my mind, it just got heavier and heavier and heavier. And it just became a bigger and bigger burden to carry. Yeah. And like, I think all musicians know well how hard vulnerability is, even in the best of circumstances. And certainly when it comes to topics like this, it's never the best of circumstances. It is, in fact, some of the worst of circumstances.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
But, you know, interestingly, and this is something, again, I've thought about for a long time, I think in a certain way it was a certain kind of vulnerability that allowed for this situation to happen. I was young, I was naive in many ways. I was literally in the first professional job of my entire career. Um, and I think that kind of vulnerability kind of set the stage for this type of abuse to happen. But at the same time, it was also in vulnerability that I began to heal. And so I think it's very easy to develop a hardened heart when situations like this occur, because to be vulnerable is to be open to woundedness. And when that is taken advantage of and you experience a wound, particularly one that's very deep, the natural inclination from that is to want to totally close yourself off and never be vulnerable again, and just build up these thick walls around your heart and around yourself for protection.
Yeah.
And in reality, it is the exact opposite of our inclination. It's the exact opposite of that response that allows us to find healing from these really horrible and traumatic situations. It is vulnerability rightly ordered and rightly understood that heals wounds that result from vulnerability being taken advantage of, if that makes sense.
Right. And it makes sense, you know. There's a really beautiful C.S. Lewis quote on vulnerability that I just looked up while you were talking, and I'm going to read it really quickly because I think it is relevant to the conversation, I think, a little bit. It's from his book The Four Loves. He says, "To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. To love is to be vulnerable." And, you know, I think of that quote in connection with Christ as the divine physician.
Mm.
And, you know, when we look at Jesus on the cross, we see God who was abused by humans. You know, I remember reading fairly recently, I think it was this past Lent, that part of why Romans would crucify people naked was a form of sexual humiliation.
Mm. Wow.
And yeah, I know, right? And so, you know, obviously we've got these crucifixes with, you know, like a loincloth for modesty for for Jesus. But in reality, that's not how he would have been. You know, they didn't do that. The Romans did not do that. And I think, you know, just in connection with between that and, you know, how we have this title of Christ as divine healer and, you know, this vulnerability being necessary to love, I think there's something very powerful in all of that, you know, in that, you know, they like, we hear a lot of times that, you know, in the passion and death and just the life of Christ in general, that, you know, no matter what we're going through in life, like whether it's, you know, joys or sorrows or sufferings or wounds, you know, Christ can relate to all of that in some way or another. If it isn't the exact same thing, it's something comparable. And here, you know, in allowing himself to be crucified specifically, he identifies with those who have been sexually assaulted, who have been sexually abused or harassed. And yet, you know, he is also God, and he is the divine healer. And ultimately all healing comes through him. And I think there's just something really profound and comforting about that image, you know.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's very profound. Yeah, I've never like quite thought about it in that way, but it actually makes perfect sense. And it is, again, like, I think we learn so much about vulnerability through Christ because, you know, much in the same way as you said, Cecilia, like his vulnerability was horrifically taken advantage of. Um, but he also never allowed that experience to harden him. And even in those very moments of, you know, the peak of his crucifixion and humiliation and shame, he was crying out for God to forgive his persecutors because they knew
Yeah.
not what they did. Um, when he
Actually, can I say, oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say something on that note of forgiveness. Um, I don't want to, like, you know, insert too much into this conversation because, you know, I haven't really, like, you know, experienced this sort of, you know, trauma and abuse on like a physical or sexual level. But I remember it was actually when you and I went to Seek in 2019.
Mm.
There was a talk that Father John Burns and Sister Miriam James Heidland gave on forgiveness and reconciliation. And I'm going to link to the talk in the show notes because it's just really good to hear, especially if no matter what you're dealing with, if you're struggling to move on from some wound in your life that someone else caused you, whether it's of this nature or of something else, it's really there's just a lot of wisdom in this talk. But one
Mm-hmm.
distinction that they made was that there is a distinction between forgiveness and reconciliation, because a lot of times we hear like we have to forgive, like, you know, like
Yes.
Christ tells us to forgive, you know, and it's like a lot of times we can have this idea that forgiveness and reconciliation are the same thing, but they are not. Forgiveness is more for us so that we can let go and move on. Reconciliation is not always possible in this life. And sometimes it's really strongly encouraged that reconciliation is not attempted, you know,
Mm-hmm.
based on, you know, the actions, certain
Yeah.
actions, you know. Um, like you wouldn't want to go back to someone who's tried to murder you, for instance, you know, like absolutely not.
No.
Reconciliation would be harmful.
Yes.
But forgiveness is possible. It's forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. So if you're listening to this and you have, you know, if there's a situation in your life, a wound in your heart that you're just really struggling with, there's someone that has profoundly, deeply hurt you, just know that it is possible to forgive them without reconciling.
Yeah.
You can do that. You know, Jesus doesn't ask us to do things that are not possible for us to do
Mm-hmm.
without his help. So he asks us to forgive, but notice he doesn't ask us to reconcile
Yeah.
always.
Definitely. Super. Actually, I'm so glad you brought that up. Like, super, super, super important distinction. And also, you know, in my own journey of forgiveness, particularly in this situation, there have been times where something new, like a new memory or a new detail, I'll be reminded of, and I have to choose to forgive all over again. And I feel like for me, my kind of journey with forgiveness in this situation has been like a very ongoing and continual thing over the past number of years. It was not a one and done type of situation.
Mm-hmm.
It was a continual choosing to forgive, even when new things were brought to light or remembered. And that's okay. And it's like, it's okay to go through seasons of grief and
Yes.
and questioning, um and having to, you know, and experiencing righteous anger as well. That's also okay.
Oh,
And
yes. Not
having
all anger is sinful.
and having to seek and strive for that forgiveness over and over and over again is okay. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. It doesn't mean that you're broken.
Amen to that. I
it
find
is
myself like almost every time I go to confession having to bring the same thing of like just struggling to forgive this one particular person in general over and over. Like it's been maybe 2 years now, and almost every single time I've had to like bring that into the confessional. But that's okay, because God wants to pour out his mercy, and he wants to pour out his grace and
his
help
healing.
us, and his healing, most importantly. And that mercy and grace leads to our healing.
I was just going to say, yeah, it's like a lifelong journey.
Absolutely. And one last note, not all wounds are fully healed this side of heaven.
Yeah.
And that is painful. But ultimately, like when we reach eternity and we reach heaven, all wounds will disappear. All wounds will be completely healed there. But that doesn't mean that the Lord doesn't want to start the process here now. And he very much does want to start that process. But if something is just taking a long time, or it just is this lifelong journey, it seems, of, trying to heal from something, not all wounds are healed this side of heaven. And that can be a really heavy thing to grapple with. But that doesn't mean to give up hope. That doesn't mean to despair. That means, to keep leaning into the love of Christ and to seek his healing, whatever way he wants to pour that out, whether it's directly or, whether it's through someone like a family member or a trusted friend, spiritual director, therapist, counselor, whatever it might be. He wants to pour out his healing, and, he wants to work on that process of healing here and now on this earth, in this life.
And there is ultimate victory over all of these
Amen
things. So, on that note, Cecilia, what have you been listening to this week for a total change of pace?
Total change of pace. It feels really weird talking about what we're listening to after that conversation. Actually, it's something I've been listening to is this really beautiful arrangement of I think it's an Irish trad song. Yes, it is. It's an Irish folk song because it's one that we did together, Tara. It's She Moved Through the Fair, and it's a beautiful instrumental arrangement of it that the harmonies are just so sweet and tender and beautiful. I cannot remember for the life of me who did the arrangement, but I will definitely have the link to that in the show notes. But it's just very beautiful. Definitely well worth listening to.
That's gorgeous. I love that piece.
So beautiful. I think actually it's even prettier than the arrangement that you and I did, Tara.
Wow.
And that was a really lovely one, the one for flute and voice. But what have you been listening to?
I have been listening to a lot of musical theater this week because my colleague was in a production of Guys and Dolls, and myself.
Oh my gosh, what a fun musical.
It is fun. It's also a bit weird in that like the plot is just basically one piece of bad advice after another, and then it just ends.
Oh, absolutely. So, it's a hot mess. It's so fun to watch.
And the music is fun as well.
Yeah.
So I've been like on a real kind of musical theater kick. It was a really great show. I really enjoyed seeing it with my colleagues, and it's great to see like your friends and the people that you work with like in a performance, because it's just like seeing them in a whole new light, and like the people I work with are just so talented. It's crazy. Anyway, so one that I've been listening to is actually a duet, and it's not actually from a musical, but it's sung by musical theater, like Broadway stars. So I'm going to kind of count it as musical theater adjacent. And it is maybe one of my favorite pieces of music ever. And it's called Flight. And it was originally,
told me about this one.
I probably have. It was originally sung as a duet by Broadway legend Sutton Foster and Megan McGinnis, who Okay. I am completely obsessed with Megan McGinnis. I think she is one of the most underrated musical theater actresses literally of all time. I think she's incredible. And I think their friendship is really a beautiful thing. They met performing in the original cast of the Broadway musical Little Women together.
Oh, cute.
Sutton Foster. Sutton Foster, of course, originated the role of Jo, and Megan McGinnis played Beth. And they have remained literally best friends since that show in like 2005 or something.
So sweet. I love that.
It's so sweet. And they have taken a lot of opportunities kind of through the years to duet together and to just perform together in whatever capacity like they were able to do so. And they were the original two singers of this duet. And it's just really beautiful and really deep. And in a sense, kind of pertinent, I think, to what we're talking about today. Talking about kind of the urge to take flight and leave all the troubles of the world behind, but kind of ultimately ending on a note that's pretty hopeful. So it's a great piece of music, and you should definitely go listen to it.
Love that. Super awesome. Well, on that note, thank you everyone for tuning in to this episode, and we will be back next week. God bless.
God bless. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Little Sparks podcast. For more information on this podcast and our ministry, please visit www.thehildegardcollective.com.